Okay, can you all hear me now? Okay, I assume most of you know what platypus is, but I'll read the boilerplate anyway. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s and 30s, new 1960s and 70s, and post-political 1980s and 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The panel discussion for tonight is on the legacy of the French Revolution. I'll read the panel description and then introduce the panelists. Thomas Jefferson wrote in regard to the Jacobin Terror that he would rather see half the earth desolated than see the revolution fail. On the other hand, it seems self-evident that the left stands in the tradition of the French Revolution. On the one hand, it seems self-evident that the left stands in the tradition of the French Revolution. On the other hand, the Jacobins left the limelight of the world historical stage, and their meaning for the left today is highly unclear. Marxism once sought to go beyond bourgeois right. Nowadays, even bourgeois right seem too radical. Why did the left emerge during the French Revolution? What does it mean to say that the French Revolution was a bourgeois revolution? And how does it compare to the American Revolution? What is the legacy of the French Revolution, and how does it task us today? Unfortunately, one of our panelists at the last moment, he's here in Leipzig, but he was feeling sick, but I'll read a description of him, even though he won't be here tonight, unfortunately. Dominique Pagani is a philosopher based in Paris who has worked on Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx, often in collaboration with Michel Clouscar. But as I said, unfortunately, Pagani can't speak today because of health problems. Mike Macnair here is a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain and author of Revolutionary Strategy. He's also taught legal history at St. Hugh College at Oxford University. And Dennis Gremmer is author and philosopher based in Germany and wrote on classic republicanism in his dissertation. So we'll have like 12 or 13 minutes for opening statements, 4-minute response. Then I'll use my privilege as a moderator to ask them questions of the panelists and then open it up to questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I'm going to gallop at speed because a short time, hopefully, make some points that are useful. I posit in the first place that the French Revolution is a moment in a series of the self-emancipation of capital from the feudal aristocracy and the church. That this self-emancipation begins with the efforts to self-emancipate of the towns within the feudal order, which issue in the Italian city-states, most of which, apart from Venice and Genoa, end in failure. That progresses then through the Dutch and British revolutions, both of which involve the overthrow of the state, the construction of a new state order founded on financial markets and the rule of law, and international war, starting with, not starting with the efforts to overthrow the new revolution from outside, the operations of Louis XIV. Actually, in the Netherlands, Spain in the 80 Years' War, the operations of Louis XIV in the 1670s, 1680s through to 1713, and continuing, the French government continued to attempt to overthrow the results of 1688 until the Peace of Paris in 1763. The same phenomenon, of course, in relation to the American Revolution, except that in the case of the American Revolution, what we've got is a political revolution of a state already a capitalist colony of a capitalist empire against its capitalist originators, but it also involves, in order for the American Revolution to be successful, it involves both France and the Netherlands intervening on the American it's just an element of the continuity. None came into this world with a saddle upon his back, neither any booted and spurred to ride him. This is from Paolo Sarpi, defending the Venetian Republic against the papacy, and it's carried from Paolo Sarpi into the leveller, Cromwellian officer and Whig rebel Richard Rumbold in his speech on the scaffold in 1683, and from Richard Rumbold to Thomas Jefferson. Second point, the sequence, Jacobinism, Thermidor, Bonapartism, Restoration, is that also of the struggle of the popolo grassi and the popolo minuti in medieval Italian city-states, of the Levellers and the Council of State Republic, Cromwellianism and Restoration in England. Mark Mulholland's Bourgeois Liberty and the Politics of Fear has pursued the dynamics which are involved in this down to, in fact, 1945 to 49. And illustrates a persistent dynamic. The bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, cannot reach for power without a proletariat, even if it's a relatively small proletariat, like the shipping proletariat of the late medieval city-states and of the Dutch and English revolutions. But as soon as it overthrows the state, it opens up the possibility of the proletariat escaping from control and is forced, therefore, to react against that possibility, even if the proletariat is in no sense capable of actually achieving its own full control and emancipation. Thirdly, the ideology of the French Revolution takes a particular form of Enlightenment ideology. This is also true of the American Revolution. It takes a particular form of Enlightenment ideology by virtue of the course of events since 1648 and 1688. The city-states, in their large majority, failed, and even Venice was generally imagined as the tyranny of the secret police of the Council of Ten. 1648 in the Netherlands, the victory of the Netherlands in the 80 Years' War, 1688 in England, show that something new has come into the world, which is not merely a return of classical antiquity, as the Italian city-states commonly imagined themselves to be, nor is it the survival of the ancient constitution, as Venice and Genoa imagined themselves to be, and the Dutch Revolution and the English Revolution imagined themselves to be. Something new has come into the world. And this something new has come into the world produces with Harrington's Oceana and with late 17th, early 18th century, particularly early 18th century political writers, the stadial theory of history, the conception that there is progress in history and that enlightenment is an aspect of genuine progress in history. This aspect of progress in history offers hope for the future, for a future beyond capitalism, far more strongly than any imminent critique of capitalism can offer. Now I move from the positive points to the negative. First, the Russian revolutionaries in the 1920s were deeply misled by imagining themselves as being reenacting the French Revolution. Their choices, they chose Stalin over Trotsky because they feared that Trotsky would be Napoleon Bonaparte. But in fact, of course, a Napoleon Bonaparte would have been less of a problem for the Russian Revolution than what eventually occurred. The result would be as if you chose the Council of State over Cromwell, and as a result, peace was made with Spain and the Dutch Republic fell. Or as if you chose the Directorate over Napoleon, and as a result, the French Revolution suffers military defeat and the monarchy is restored complete with feudalism in the late 1790s. Second point. The French Revolution has given rise to the concept of a sequence of national revolutions. This is notoriously Stalinism. When we were talking about Stalinism involving distinguishing between the American and the French revolutions, a considerable amount of this is about the idea of the French Revolution as a purely national revolution, something which happens internally. This is a half-truth, but the French Revolution issues in a general European war, just as 1688 issued in a general European war, just as 1568 to 1648 was part of a general European war. Conversely, the Russian Revolution, 1688 grows out of the Dutch Revolution, the American Revolution grows out of 1688. Spencer Leonard, I think, made that point earlier in the earlier discussion, and I think correctly. The French Revolution unambiguously grows out of the American Revolution, because although the French intervention helps the American Revolution to win, it results in bankruptcy of the French state, which enables the appearance of the American Revolution. Conversely, the Russian Revolution, the imperialist chain breaks at the weakest link, Lenin said, but it breaks at the weakest link during 1914-18. And the first step in that moment is the French mutinies of 1916. The step goes down to the revolutions of 1918, and from there to 1919 and the world on fire, and the Biennio Rosso of 1920 to 21 in Italy. Similarly, the revolutionary movement of 1941 to 49 is an international movement. The bourgeois revolution is already, the capitalist revolution is already an international movement. The proletarian revolution will be a fortiori and necessarily an international movement, far more necessarily. The self-image of the French Revolution, the image of the French Revolution as a national revolution, created by the discourse of socialism in one country in the 1920s, is deeply misleading. Thirdly, the image of the revolution among the far left is of street movements, and nothing but street movements. It doesn't matter what those street movements are for. This is current far left politics. I think it's already problematic in 1956. Its inability to distinguish between revolution and counter-revolution, between revolution and colour revolution. The extraordinary level of disorientation, particularly of the left faced with the Arab Spring of 2011, but also of the Euromaidan movement, etc., etc., etc. There's inability to distinguish between revolution and counter-revolution. There's also inability to distinguish between revolution and, quote, a well-organized, well-orchestrated swell of public protest, unquote. And finally, how useful is the concept of the left as an inheritance from the French Revolution? I pose this as a problem. We know that the concept of the left comes simply from the seating arrangements of the French National Assembly. Policy Exchange, or American-funded think tank, which is a form of a US, or at least US capital's intervention in British politics, is running a project for, quote, the future of the left. The future of the left in Policy Exchange's point of view is to be fully Atlanticist and socially conservative. So this would be a conservative left controlled by conservatives. Conversely, the French left, talk of the left, has gone through a series of, picked up the Wikipedia Union de la Gauche, going back to the Bloc de Gauche of 1902 and forward even to the Nouveau Front Populaire of last year. What comes out of this is the union of the disloyal left together with the loyal left on the terms of the loyal left. The Nouveau Front Populaire, NUPES, the clearest example, the Parti Socialiste, almost on its uppers, almost PASOKified, is restored by the principle of unity of the left to a commanding position, which it then uses to support Macron's government. How useful then is the concept of the left? I think it's much more useful to think about very classic Marxism, the unity of socialism with the organized workers' movement, rather than trying to formulate it in terms of the left and its future. That's it.
Hear me? Perfect. Okay, so I want to attack 3 propositions that I'm gonna now explain to you, like 3 ideas that I think are really prevalent among the left, like almost everyone believes them. I've believed them for a long time, but yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. So the first one is the following. The bourgeois revolutions, among them of course the French Revolution, but also the American Revolution, maybe the English Revolution, were carried out by the bourgeoisie to abolish feudalism. Okay, this is the first one I want to attack. Second one, the bourgeois revolutions established formal liberty in accordance with their liberal principles, but they failed at equality. Also something I hear really often, bourgeois revolution, they did the liberty thing, but now we need equality or something like that. Third thing, the revolution was an expression of Enlightenment rationality versus pre-modern superstition. So like the Enlightenment philosophy inspired the bourgeois revolutions, and they fought against the kind of pre-modern Christian superstition. I think all of these 3 ideas are completely false. Okay, let's begin. So firstly, like England and America were definitely not feudal. I mean, that's not even controversial, right? Like the English society was a completely commercial society during the time of the English Revolution. It was not a feudal society. There was a nobility, but the economic relations were completely based on free commerce. There was a big kind of yeoman class of landowners, so it wasn't a feudal society. And it was basically a struggle between like parliament and the crown. Both of them were supported by nobles and commoners. In America, I mean, I think no one would say that America was in any way feudal. But also France was not really feudal. I mean, there were some residues of feudalism, and in the revolution they were abolished, but that wasn't the main point of France. Actually, the revolution began as a struggle between the feudal parlements and the crown. So there were these kinds of, feudal courts of law, basically, and the first thing that really made like headlines was the struggle between these feudal residues and the crown, and the people sided with the parlements against the crown. So clearly, it was not a revolution against feudalism. But let me give you some other points. So. Basically, what we see as these authoritarian governments against which the bourgeois revolution fought. With France, we even call it absolute monarchy, right? They were not feudal governments. Actually, they were established in opposition to feudalism. It was the crown that fought against the feudal nobility in order to establish centralized, modern states. So they had a kind of bureaucracy. They had the nobles didn't like rule their own fiefdoms in this kind of Game of Thrones like way, but they were like Beamte, like they were bureaucrats and administrators, right? So it was a kind of centralized modern state that was established in the early modern period. And it was based on ideas of rationality. It was exactly this kind of medieval idea of like we have the different estates, we have the crown, we have the feudal nobility, we have the free cities, we have the church, we have the peasant communes, and they all check each other in this kind of almost checks and balances kind of way. This was abolished by the early modern rationalization of society. So, I mean, Foucault describes this as this kind of move from sovereignty to disciplinary society and blah, blah, blah. But you know what I mean. Like, it's the kind of modernization of bureaucratic apparatus that happened in the early modern period and was thoroughly anti-feudal. Like, the crown waged war against feudalism in order to establish this centralized modern state. So this modern state, the absolute state, or even like the British monarchy, was already a kind of proto-modern state. And it was the bourgeois revolution that fought against this kind of state. So it didn't fight against the like kind of feudal pyramid. It fought against something that was already bureaucratic, that was already extremely organized, and that had an idea that in German was called gute Polizei. So before, the governments were content in just like getting some taxes and levies, and then people could basically do whatever they wanted. So you just have this kind of personal relationship of, like in a mafia, of loyalty to the king, and then you have dukes and counts, and they have to swear fealty, and that's everything. But with early modern political thought, you had this idea of gute Polizei, of good policy, so that the government now was responsible for everything. So for managing the population, increasing economic growth, education and stuff like this. So it became more and more authoritarian precisely because it became more and more enlightened or modern. It had this idea of now we have to administer all of society in a rational way. Okay. So the French Revolution, in this sense, and the American and the English revolutions too, were revolutions, again, it was already a self-critical movement of the Enlightenment. It wasn't enlightenment versus superstition. It was a self-critical enlightenment against the authoritarianism of an earlier, like Cartesian, top-down model of rationality. It was a new model of rationality that believed that you need counterforces, like checks and balances. You can't just have someone and say you are now the one who administers society rationally. You need this kind of counterforce to it. And this is why they loved reading these ancient philosophers, right? Like Cicero or Levius or like Machiavelli, because these classical Republicans had these ideas of separations of powers and checks and balances, and you shouldn't have a tyrant and stuff. So they were like completely preoccupied with this idea of tyranny that they have to get rid of, all of the bourgeois revolutions. The French Revolution also was not a revolution of capitalists, because there were no capitalists, basically. Capitalism is only possible if the forces of production have reached a level where you have industrial machinery, so that the worker is separated from the means of production and they have to sell their labor power to a capitalist in order to survive. These societies, the French society in the French Revolution, or the American society in the American Revolution, English society, were commercial societies. That meant that people were not like subservient to a capitalist, they were like Kleinbürger, like petit bourgeois. They had their own means of production and they would trade with others. So they were already free in this sense in the economic realm because they could produce and trade with each other. And these were the people who made the revolution, not the capitalists against the feudalists. It was the petit bourgeois landowners and especially artisans, Handwerker, who made the revolution together with the professional classes, also petit bourgeois, the lawyers, the intellectuals, the journalists. These people made the revolution against the bureaucrats, against the absolute rational state of gute Polizei. So I think this is one really important thing to remember. And as a Marxist, you can't like project things into the past. Like capitalism is a specific stage of human development introduced by big machinery, which means that we can't own the means of production, right? Like we have to sell our labor power to a capitalist. Back then you could own the means of production. You just have your shop and you produce things and you exchange them with others. So, okay. Another important point. The French Revolution, I would argue, established full equality. The problem is the problem of liberty. Obviously, full equality wasn't established for everyone. Like you still had the suppression of oppression of women, and you had, for example, in America, you had slavery. So full equality, and equality means legal equality, right? Like Marx always attacks this idea of equality as anything else than legal equality. Equality is a Republican idea from the bourgeois revolution that means that, we are legally the same, okay? Legal equality. And legal equality was the program of the bourgeois revolution. It was established, and then through the emancipation of women and the abolition of slavery, it was universalized. So we have equality. But what we don't have is liberty. Because in this commercial society, it was thought if we just, destroy this evil bureaucracy and we prevent tyranny and we have a freedom-based system with checks and balances, with the rule of law and stuff like this, then we will be free. We have to get rid of the last vestiges of feudalism. Yes, in France at least there were some places where still like some peasants were in these relations of subordination. But for the urban masses who carried out the revolution, it was just about like getting rid of an authoritarian state. But with industrial machinery, we got a new source of unfreedom, which means being a worker, right? Like being a laborer, being employed by someone else. And actually, even in the 19th century, people like Abraham Lincoln, who, according to the conventional narrative, he's like a capitalist because the bourgeois revolution is pro-capitalist and it's liberal, and so they like this. No. Abraham Lincoln was completely opposed to wage labor. He thought it's just like a phase in your life. Maybe if you're like really young, you can do some wage labor, but it's like really shameful and it's a state of slavery basically. But then you have the money to buy like a small house or like a farm, or you can be a kind of artisan, you learn from your master, and then you're free. So this whole idea of the bourgeois revolution was we can be free in commercial society as independent yeoman farmers, homesteaders, or artisans. With capitalist industrial machinery, this became impossible. Like we can never have a society that uses the full technological potential that we have unleashed and at the same time can be free with commercial relations, because then we have capitalism, right? Like we have some people who own the means of production and others who have to work for them. So we become, and this is not just rhetorics, for the classical Republicans, for even the labor Republicans in the 19th century, this was a state similar to slavery, to be employed by someone else. So now technology brought us into this kind of state of affairs where commercial society just cannot guarantee liberty anymore. So what I think is that it's not the case that basically they were backwards, like the French Revolution was actually like a kind of already the class struggle that we have in Marx. We have a proletariat, and this is like the Jacobins. Then we have the evil bourgeoisie, and they have this kind of fight, and the bourgeoisie just wants to topple feudalism. That's not the true story. The true story is that civil society, this is why it's a bourgeois revolution, because civil society made a revolution against the centralized state. And this word even of bourgeois society in Hegel is a translation that Hegel used for actually what Adam Smith calls civil society. So the bourgeois revolution is the revolution of civil society against the state. And now we have reintroduced unfreedom through capitalist relations of production. And now we have to get rid of these capitalist relations of production. So they were not backwards. Technology wasn't there to create capitalist relations of production. They had their own relations of production, which were petit bourgeois, and they did the right thing under these circumstances. They established equality and freedom under the historical circumstances that the development of the productive forces at that time allowed them to do. And now we have different relations of production because we have different forces of production, so we need to liberate ourselves once more. And it's a question not of equality but of freedom, because as a wage laborer, you're like a slave, right? Like you're subservient to someone else. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Hear me? Okay. So they're each going to respond to each other, but I forgot one thing that's important, which is there's a absent thing on this, which is Spencer's talk tomorrow at 11 o'clock. You can Google it. It's going to be a book discussion about a book that he's just put out. Okay, why don't you respond?
Yeah, I don't agree with, we quite clearly we don't agree. For what it's worth, my understanding is that capitalism in the full sense is the circuit money, commodity, production, and production organized by organized groups of workers working on concentrated means of production in the ownership of the capitalist, leading to produced commodity, leading to higher level of money. Yeah. Now, in my understanding, this phenomenon emerges in two contexts in the Middle Ages. One, and the one which is decisive, is the shipping industry. The shipping industry, both the big ships which are employed in the Mediterranean and in the North Sea, and the docks which enable those big ships to move bulk goods, depend on organized groups of labor working as wage laborers in conditions of unfreedom. So that capitalism is already emerging within the bowels of feudalism and not passing through a stage of the existence solely of the petty bourgeois. Secondly, there was a gentleman who bought from Saxony the right to the rights to tin plating, and he and his partners set up in business as tin plating operators in England. At which point it appeared that King Charles II had privately given a crony a patent for tin plating, so that our man was put out of business. Yeah. The personal loyalty, it's discussed in Hilton Root's book, The Fountain of Privilege. It's discussed in Breen's Law, City and King in relation to the local government in France and the monarchy. It's discussed on the other side in Paul Halliday's Dismembering the Body Politic in relation to local government. The rule of law emerges as a result of 1640 to 1660 and 1688. It emerges as a result of the Dutch Revolution before it. It emerges as a result of the French Revolution. The personal loyalty characteristic of feudalism persists. Personal dependence and personal loyalty characteristic of feudalism persists in France down to the Revolution of 1789. That's it.
Sorry, these are really good examples. Like I really love them. Like the first one, it's absolutely correct. Like I mean, in the shipping industry, this was the first big industry that actually had capital, in the sense that you could invest a lot. With someone right now, yes, we talked about this even like a few minutes ago, where we were talking about, yes, I was saying, okay, but there was basically no capitalism, and then you were saying, like, yeah, but okay, Adam Smith already talks about capital as a thing that goes into the process. And yes, this is because of shipping. Because in the shipping industry, you actually already had this kind of large-scale machinery, the ships. But it was like a extremely small part of the overall economy. And the people who were employed by these shipping companies were like a minuscule part of the population. So like the French and the English and the American revolutions were not carried out by proletarians. And also, if you look at it, also they were not carried out by the capitalists. So if you look at like the identities of all of these people who did the revolutions, like these small groups of people, like the really small number of capitalists who owned these ships and the small number of sailors who worked for them or dock people, they were like politically almost irrelevant compared to the petit bourgeois elements of society. Then the thing you told us about these tin plating affairs, I think this is exactly what I mean when I say it was a revolution of civil society against the state, because these were not feudal relations. I think these were forms of corruption typical for Bonapartism. So it's actually the same that happened in, Marx describes this in the 18th Brumaire, when the bourgeois society became really dominated by the state again, right? Like his idea is the capitalist class has like given up their like political power and they gave it to the state in order to suppress the working class and in order to like, you know, manage the economy and stuff like this. So like we are now living in Bonapartism and now we have these same problems that they had before the bourgeois revolution. State apparatus that's more and more unaccountable and therefore they can make these special deals with people, right? So this is actually a result of state power, of the weakness of civil society and the strength of a authoritarian state, that it can make these kinds of special arrangements and give privileges to specific capitalists or specific, you know, like industrial conglomerates or something like this. So we see this every day in our capitalist states, and something similar happened under these monarchies. And that is exactly why people, this is one of the reasons why people made the revolution, because they wanted the rule of law and they didn't want these special arrangements between this extremely powerful centralized state apparatus and then specific business interests, which was even much worse in the time of absolutism or of at least like centralized royal rule than it was under feudalism. Because you had this all-powerful state, like there was almost no one you could go to. Like if the government hates you or if they want to promote you, that means like you have either won or lost. So it's actually a question of state authoritarianism in this example.
I'm going to take my prerogative as moderator to ask them questions. So I'm interested in Mike Macnair, like how you would define feudalism, because it seems to me there's a big difference between the society of, say, 18th century France and 12th to 13th. You also brought up the example of the Popolo Minuto and the Popolo Grasso, and I'm wondering how you would then see, for example, an even earlier struggle of like class struggle in the ancient world, like whether that also has a bourgeois or proto-bourgeois character or something completely different. And that brings up the question also of the text that's often read in Platypus of the liberty of the ancients and moderns compared. And to Dennis Kremer, oh, okay. Well, yeah, so I mean, you talk about the rationality of the absolutist state, but clearly the pre-revolutionary late 18th century state was, while it might have been rational compared to a true feudalism, had a massive irrationalities. And in that sense, the bourgeois revolution could be seen as rationalizing that. And also you could argue, I think, that the bourgeois state that succeeded it was actually more centralized and more powerful than any, quote, feudal state of the 18th century. And the question for both of you also, because it's a subject that sort of interests me, is France in 1789 was 85% peasant. It's true, of course, that the revolution was predominantly led by urban classes, the sans-culottes, and the bourgeois intellectuals. But certainly the peasants also played a role, both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, and peasant revolutions have played a big role in the 20th century. So I'm curious how you see the role of the peasants, if you see them.
Okay, I understand feudalism as we've started with the slavery of classical antiquity, which involves, as Orlando Patterson describes slavery, the exclusion of the slaves as a group from the social order. Feudalism starts with the manor, and the inclusion of the villeins as part of the social order, but their subjection to a range of customary duties, and the subjection, the consuetudines of the Lord are paralleled in the consuetudines of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Dean and Chapter of Canterbury and the Prior of Ely sue each other over jurisdiction over a murderer. Yeah. Feudalism works like that, and feudalism actually continues to work like that all the way down to the revolutionary movement. Then in relation to the Popolo Grasso and the Popolo Minuto, precisely the point in relation to classical antiquity is that the people who are in the Popolo Minuto would not figure at all in class struggles in ancient Rome. Rather different in Athens, but not equally in, Sparta. It's the Messenians who can have class struggle, but not the chattel slaves. Finally, peasants. Yeah, this is important. This is an important one. I think it's Marx somewhere says that the French way is the really revolutionary way, as opposed to the American way or the English way, which involves the disappearance of the peasantry as a class. Yeah. I think, in fact, it's the reverse. The preservation of the peasantry as a class in the French Revolution and also in the Russian Revolution operates as a drag on the capitalist economy and as a drag on the political structure, because the patriarchalism of once the peasantry is freed from the exactions of the Lord, the patriarchalism and land hunger of the peasantry produces in its turn what Marx described in the 18th Brumaire, of the peasantry as the fundamental social basis of Bonapartism, because the peasantry, not because the peasantry cannot revolt or cannot make revolution, but because the peasantry as a class cannot rule, but can only set up a ruler to extort from it. And in fact, that's actually what's happening in 1920s Russia, that the peasantry sets up a new czar to extract surplus from it in the shape of the General Secretary.
Okay, so let me just, before I forget this, begin with this idea of enlightenment and modernity and stuff. I absolutely agree that the bourgeois revolutions were more enlightened than the absolute or even like the British monarchy before them. What I just want to say is that it's not the case that the thing against which they rebel is just like primitive superstition. It was already a modern state, and some of the things, like later, for example, some people say, like postmodernists, for example, they say something like, yeah, the Enlightenment has these kinds of weak spots, right? Like the Enlightenment has these inherent authoritarian tendencies, and now we need postmodernity or postmodern thought to correct this. And what I just want to say is, no, yes, maybe, I don't care, but they already did it in the bourgeois revolutions. There was a deeply authoritarian impulse in the kind of proto-enlightenment modernist ideas, because it had this kind of, okay, let's get rid of tradition, but now we can, society becomes like a body to make experiments on. Like we just need to increase population, do this, do that, and then we have this kind of machine almost that can just intervene, do something, gute Polizei, okay, now it works better, and now we go there, we do something, like a complete kind of transparency, like an object that you can experiment with. And this is an aspect of the enlightened or modern thought that the bourgeois revolutions try to curtail. So they are already a self-criticism of the Enlightenment. They are completely Enlightenment, but in a self-critical way. So that's what I wanted to say. But I don't want to say that they are like, I don't know, like backwards romanticist or something. Like they even increase the principle of Enlightenment by criticizing it. Now to the peasants. So like, first, like, I have a kind of emotional problem with this, because on the one hand, like, there are a lot of kind of really heroic episodes of like peasant resistance against authoritarian rule, and certainly in the French Revolution, and even more so in the American Revolution, like peasants did things that, or not in the American there were no peasants, but farmers or like yeomen. Maybe that's a different thing. Let's say in the French, the peasants did a lot of things that also then challenged the authority of the nobility and the state and stuff like this. So, and I respect that. But on the like grand scale of things, the peasantry was a reactionary class. Like, if people, this was actually the difference between Girondists and the Montagne, like the Mountain Party. Like, normally, like, the leftist reading is just like, yeah, the Mountain Party is the pro-capitalist party, and then you have the like more radical, the other way around. The Girondists are the pro-capitalist party, then you have the more radical Mountain Party, and they are pro-proletariat. No, the difference was in tactics. Both were Republicans. They had almost the same ideas about democracy, about a free republic and stuff. They were neither modern pro-capitalist liberals nor socialists. Like, they were Republicans. But for the Gironde, like, they had a really kind of abstract understanding of democracy. So, yeah, let's make like elections in France and ask everyone what they want, and then we go to the countryside and we ask them and stuff. And for the Mountain Party, like the Robespierre Party, normally we call them Jacobins, but actually both of them are the Jacobins. But for the Mountain Party, it was like, no, we have these masses on the street, like the sans-culottes. We have these kinds of sections, or the Paris Commune, not the one from 71, but there was already a Paris Commune during the original French Revolution. Like, we have the Paris Commune, we have the National Guard, and we have the sections. And the sections are basically like a kind of like, I would call them, they are not really anarchists, but you know what I mean, like, they have these kinds of council meetings and then they're voting for stuff, and they were like, ordinary artisans and normal people who were really politically active. So all of these groups, the National Guard, the Paris Commune, and these sections, they are on our side. But the countryside is obviously not on our side. Like, they don't want these radical Republican things. So the Mountain Party said, yeah, fuck it, but we have the masses on the streets, so we can do the revolutionary deed, and then it's a fait accompli. So there was a tactical difference between these groups. And then the Girondins, they lost their temper. Like, they tried to abolish the Paris Commune. Like, they even threatened Paris with making France march on Paris. So, like, they threatened them that, okay, look, you are just like a few radical people on the streets, but we have the whole country behind us. So if you continue to push for these kinds of anti-democratic things you want to do, we will take France and attack Paris. And this is what made the people side with the Mountain Party. So it wasn't like this kind of liberal capitalists against proto-socialists. It was a kind of, on the one hand, there was a kind of too formal idea of what democracy is, and on the other hand, there was a kind of realistic reckoning with the fact that this was an urban movement of petit bourgeois people, and that if you ask the peasants, then the revolution will be lost. And as you see in the Vendée, for example, this was completely correct. So, like, I'm totally for against Stalinism and this kind of dictatorship, but I do think that there's a phase in a revolution where you have the masses on the street, or like the organized workers, or like intellectuals and stuff like this, but you don't have the majority of the population, and then it's time to act. And this is just the difference between the Mountain Party and the Gironde. So, yeah, so that's what I want to say about the peasants. I think overall they were a counter-revolutionary force, and they were so in Russia also. And the revolution would have never happened if they had the same voice as the petit bourgeois elements in the cities.
Okay, so I just want to pick up some general themes. One is the subject of Jacobinism has been touched on. So I'd like each of you to give your evaluation. For example, Trotsky called Jacobinism the highest form that bourgeois radicalism could achieve. Like, do you agree with that? And the other thing is that the theme here from both of you, to a certain extent, maybe more from Mike Macnair, is the idea of history moving forward through class struggle, right? There are other ways, perhaps, of understanding the French Revolution and other revolutions. And again, the question would be, how do those class struggles, either pre-bourgeois or the struggle of the bourgeoisie against, quote, the feudal class or the absolutist state, are those analogous to the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class?
Right. First off, I don't care in relation to what Trotsky. Trotsky may have characterized the Jacobins as the highest form of bourgeois radicalism. I don't care, frankly. Basically, okay, it is part of the history of it's recognized, it's part of the history of the movement and so on. Trotsky also characterized, said that British socialists should take Cromwell as a guide to action rather than the levellers in Where's Britain Going. It's in either case, it's grand speculation and fun, but
the Jacobins came to power, the levellers didn't.
Yeah, but they only came to power for momentary. They have a momentary moment in power. And in a sense, it's where we are, where the left is. There's a sense in which I'm not going to say that it's the right answer, but we have to ask the question whether it would have been right for the Bolsheviks to gamble with state power in the 1920s and risk being thrown back in the 1920s and preserving the image of the workers' movement as the movement of political democracy, as opposed to choosing to hang on to state power, and in order to hang on to state power, to ban all other parties other than Bolshevism, to ban factions within the Bolshevik party, to theorize the dictatorship of the proletariat as necessarily the dictatorship of the advanced part over the backward majority, and then if that follows, it results in the party leadership is the advanced part of the party over the backwards majority, and the Politburo is the advanced part over the Central Committee, and the General Secretary is the advanced part over the Politburo. So that this set of decisions which the Bolsheviks made in order to hang on to power, it's as problematic.
Just to clarify one thing, are you saying that part of the problem was they analogized themselves to the Jacobins?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Part of the problem is that they analogized themselves to the Jacobins. History moving forward through class struggles, it's just standard Marx. Yeah. And to be honest, I think that I know it's standard Marx and it's been criticized endlessly by one or another revisionist school. I think that actually the underlying evidence is in favor of it. But what's missing in the narrative is, in my opinion, that when a class is in decline, it collapses into the state. That we need to think of the state as separate from class. We need to think of a state as a kind of protection racket which has enough armed force in a locality, in an area, to extract tax and force other competitors for tax back to nothing more than hit and run. Yeah? And when a class order is in decline, the ability of the class to function as a class collapses into the state, but the state preserves its constitutional tie to the old ruling class. And it's for that reason that a new rising class has to overthrow the state in order to set free back from the commune, set free the elements of the new society.
Just to clarify what you're saying, is that the sense in which you would call the Ancien Regime feudal?
Yeah. You can give examples. The Roman Empire, which is comparable, sets up wholly artificial cities which no longer exist because they were set up merely for the needs of the state. The Louis XIV's government wants to create canals to imitate the Dutch. In order to create canals, it sub-infeudates the line of the canal to an aristocrat on condition of providing a certain number of soldiers, which is just such an extraordinarily artificial phenomenon. The government of Charles II, which again, it's a dual power, it's a sort of dual power. The government of Charles II establishes the Carolinas on the basis of a feudal constitution drawn by John Locke. Not quite, it's adapted from the constitution drawn by John Locke, but it's already in John Locke's drawing, it's feudal. So this creation of artificial feudalism, and similarly the preservation, the feudal ruling class is bifurcated between aristocrats and priests, and in Japan between daimyo and samurai on the one hand and Buddhist monks on the other. You know, that bifurcation, clinging on to the old religion, is still clinging on to feudalism, even if you've marginalized the political power of the military aristocrats. Sorry, this.
Okay. We are in a basic agreement about the fact that yes, class struggle drives history, but the state has an independent, some kind of important role in it. And this is also why I wanted to, why I characterize the bourgeois revolutions basically as revolutions of bourgeois society or civil society against the state. And Marx recognizes this really clearly in the 18th Brumaire, when he has this idea of abdication by the bourgeoisie. I think the difference between our positions is that for me the state is not just like a kind of tool or like an expression, I don't know whether I'm mischaracterizing, but something that a class uses to as almost like an instrument. Like I think the state does have its own presence, and in abdicating, the bourgeoisie empowers a state apparatus that in some structural sense is also similar to the absolutist one. Like the state has its own kind of presence, and so yes, history is class struggle, but class struggle always in relation to the state. And the socialist revolution, therefore, I think is definitely also the revolution against the state. So even like if you look at the early Soviet Union, like they even retained a lot of capitalism, the same in the Spanish Revolution made by the anarchists. Like you still have capitalist elements, and in a certain sense, you could say that even Germany today, if you look at Staatsquote or something like this, is less capitalist than an early revolutionary regime. But this doesn't mean that we are further on the road to socialism, right? So it's mainly a question of political power. The transformation economically from capitalism to socialism is a gradual process. The Revolutionary Act is the destruction of the Bonapartist administrative state. So I think, therefore, it's really important to think about the role of the state in class struggle. Now about the Jacobins. So, like, I completely agree that the levelers are the good guys and Cromwell is evil. But I think the Jacobins are something else. So I reject this kind of binary idea of either we have democracy and then everyone's got to have a say and everything's going to be fine from the beginning in the revolution. We have complete, like I'm a really fanatical like free speech and like bourgeois liberty person, but in the revolution to, you know, I mean, you got to be realistic. Okay, so the thing is, but the other way is not like party dictatorship. Like I think what a revolutionary dictatorship is the dictatorship of the revolutionary mass movement. Like that is revolutionary dictatorship. Not of a party, but of the revolutionary mass movement. And this is exactly what like the early Soviet Union tried to do, like in the early days, like Lenin and Trotsky tried to do. And that is exactly what the Jacobins did. And you can see it even though it's like an unsavory example, but with the September massacres. Like there's this really good book by Sophie Warnig, I think she's called, and there's a foreword by Slavoj Žižek. It's an interesting book, A Defense of the Terror, it's called. And it tries to basically say why did the Jacobins establish this kind of, you know, thing. And the September massacres play an important role here. Like it was a kind of expression of a anxiety by the revolutionaries against counter-revolution. So there was the armies of Austria and other like enemies of the revolution marching on the revolution. And I've seen some like videos of people who were in the Spanish Revolution. Then people asked them, so what was it like? Were you afraid? And this guy said, yes, we were completely afraid all the time, but not for our lives, but for the revolution. So like you have built this thing and you have this like extreme hope that it might make the world a better place and that you win freedom, and then the whole world allies and sends their armies to crush you. So this was the situation. And in this kind of paranoid situation, then people started to like, you know, go into the prison and kill people who were supposed to be counter-revolutionaries. I think most of them were actually innocent and stuff like this. But the Jacobins just understood that to make a revolution means to make it with the mass movement. Not with like the abstract democratic majority of the population and not with a one-party rule, but with the movement on the streets. So I think that is something really important, like not to be either like a formalist democrat in the revolution, but also not to be a Stalinist who believes in like strict party structures, but to empower the masses who actually are the revolution on the street. And their structures, their sections, their trade unions, their whatever they build, right? Like it's an empowerment of the revolutionary movement. I think that's what the Jacobins try to do, and this is something I support, I guess.
I think we're going to open it up for questions from the floor. I just wanted to say about the September massacres. It seemed to me that the Jacobin leadership was quite uncomfortable with them, and that what you're really dealing there with is popular violence, and the question, therefore, of popular revolutionary violence and its role in a revolution.
That's also there in 1688.
Yes, in all sorts of revolutions. And then there's popular counter-revolutionary violence too.
One sentence, absolutely everyone was disgusted by it. The difference was just like for the Gironde, they publicly distanced themselves, and the Mountain Party said, okay, we really don't like this, but we stand by the popular movement. So this was
And you think that standing by the popular movement, even when it carries out this kind of violence,
is necessary, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Or in America, tarred and feathered, you run out of town.
Okay. Everyone, somebody, you can pick it.
Thank you. So, Marx in his youth considered himself a radical Jacobin, meaning that, and I suppose you could disagree, he thought that there was an ideological or historical aspiration of the Jacobins as a tendency in the French Revolution, which still needed to be maintained. That either the French Revolution in France was incomplete or that its aspirations needed to be extended to the rest of Europe in the sense of legal equality and the expansion of formal democracy. Of course, 1848 seems to block this and present difficulties, which lead Marx to abandoning this as the description. Maybe not a reappraisal of the French Revolution, but a recognition that something different is now the task. And so the question I want to ask is, in what senses today could we say that the French Revolution is nonetheless incomplete? This doesn't need to be a binary answer, but maybe a question of gradation. In what ways is the French Revolution today nonetheless incomplete? And in what ways is that expressed today? How do people relate back to this? And in what ways does the invocation of Marxism add anything?
Of this, like I would say, and I would say the same about Marx, but I would call myself just like a 19th century radical in an industrial society who came to terms that we are living in an industrial society. So I think that's just the thing. Like it's the same project, but industrial revolution, the proletariat, capitalism has changed the coordinates so thoroughly that the same kind of aspiration for freedom, the same political project, now has to be realized in a very different way, that is through the class struggle of the proletariat.
Yeah, I wouldn't identify the project as the same project. The project I would identify as the emancipation of the proletariat, which can only be achieved by the proletariat as a class laying collective hands on the means of production as a whole, which is something which can only take place. I mean, I think it's conceivable that it could take place on a European scale, in the sense that a common European dictatorship of the proletariat could stand off American or Chinese counter-revolution, but I don't think it can take place on any national scale. I also think that the framing of the French Revolution is a framing of the creation of the rule of law, but it seems to me that what we can see in the administrative law of the advanced capitalist countries is that the rule of law eats itself, that the rule of law, by turning into the multiplication of laws and into the conversion of law into judicial discretion, collapses back into I wouldn't call it Bonapartism as Dennis did, but it really is the case that we collapse back into absolutism, but we collapse back into absolutism by attempting to make law govern everything, by having unaccountable judicial power, whether in the United States Supreme Court or in the European Court of Justice.
So I don't want to speak too much, but I have two brief historical questions. One is, how do you both see the Babeuvist interval? And the other is, what do you guys think of the Constant idea that the Jacobins wanted to restore ancient liberty and that they misunderstood the character of modernity?
I just want to answer the second question because I think that I have more to say about this. And then I have to pee. So, so the thing is the following. I think Constant is wrong, and I think this is something where a lot of like platypus people, like, they read it, I think, as a regular thing in the syllabus and stuff. I've done a lot of research on classical republicanism, and I absolutely don't see it that way. Like the whole bourgeois revolution, the American Revolution, the French revolutions, they all had this classical republican perspective. They didn't have modern liberalism. Like, modern liberalism is something really late. Like, it emerges in the 19th century, even in the beginning of the 19th century. Like, classical republican ideas were more prevalent, and classical republicanism did not say it's just like a kind of collective, it's not the case that it's just like, okay, now we have this polis rule and that's it. It had also these kinds of, all of these protections that we associate with liberalism. So the real picture is just much more complex. Like the idea of a rule of law, of a separation of powers and stuff like this, which we identify with liberalism today. It was a core element of classical republicanism. It is even like in Rousseau, it's really strong. Like, Rousseau is completely adamant on the separation of powers, on the rule of law, on protections of individuals against the government. So I do think if you really study like the evolution of the idea of liberty in the European context, at least, beginning with the ancients and then through the Florentine Republic, like Machiavelli is really, really important, the levelers, the whole debate in England and Scotland, in what now is the UK, and then go to the American Revolution, French Revolution, you see a kind of classical republican intellectual tradition that is thoroughly bourgeois, I would say. Like, it leads to the bourgeois age and it inspires these revolutions. And for Constant, there is this kind of binary of like the ancient way and then the modern way, which is almost like already liberal. And that's just not, like, I've studied this really extensively. It's just not what happened, actually. Like, there is this kind of, I would say it's like Machiavelli to after the Napoleonic Wars. There was this kind of classical republican ideology or worldview, and you can really identify what it is, and it definitely combines a lot of elements that for Constant are like polar opposites. Like, they just appear together in a harmonic way, actually, philosophically. Like, they need each other to exist. So yeah, therefore I disagree with Constant.
I agree with most of that, if not all of that. I think it's actually fairly visible in Marx's writings, and in when we shift from looking at what Marx wrote to looking at what Karl Kautsky wrote, it's fairly clear that Karl Kautsky thought about, when he said democracy, he meant the United States of America, not any sort of classical Republican constitution. And that he internalizes liberal ideas. I would say, actually, I think also that paradoxically, in relation to the Bolsheviks, that the internalization of liberal ideas is part of the reason for committing the error of turning everything over to the secret police, because it's difficult for them to think of passing discriminatory laws. Yeah. The Venetian Republic, faced with counter-revolution, turns everything over to the secret police. Yeah. The English post-1688 regime, faced with counter-revolution, passes a series of discriminatory laws against Catholics, against people who will not swear the oath of allegiance to the Williamite and then to the Hanoverian crown, which in fact it's illusion. Wilf Prest has done work on the Whig and Hanoverian regime held guys as Jacobite prisoners, as prisoners without trial for as much as 50 years between the 1690s and 1740s. It's not as there's no repression, but there's a big difference in the effects of having discriminatory repressive legislation, which is and having general non-undiscriminatory repressive legislation. The Barbovists, okay, it's part of the history of our movement, but then so are the diggers, and so are, in a sense, so are the revolution, the peasant rebels of the 1520s, and Munster's Anabaptist Commune, and before that the Mazdakists in early Islamic Iran, and so on and so on.
Okay, why don't we go back to the audience questions?
So please just raise your hand after every question, because I have a rough overview, but I can't remember all hands. I'll try to keep the right order, okay?
Thanks. In your view, what relationship does the Haitian Revolution have to the French Revolution and its legacy? I ask that because in my Trotskyist days, I ran a reading group on C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins. We used to underscore the back and forth dynamics between the events in France and in Haiti, how the Haitian revolutionaries picked up ideas that were spread or articulated in the French Revolution, etc. But it also occurs to me that it's very easy to turn the Haitian revolutions into simply a means of legitimating the French Revolution, as if the ideas and causes of the French Revolution only become valid or worthy because they were picked up by the black slaves of Haiti. Thank you.
So yeah, firstly, I would say like the value of the French Revolution stands on its own, or like it. I would completely disagree with this attempt to use it as a kind of way to. Also, in general, like the kind of all of the different modes of exclusion that were present in these revolutions always really dislike this this kind of talk about, yeah, but look in Haiti, then they made the revolution, so this shows that the French Revolution, that they weren't racist, or like you had a few like really like radical like kind of feminists on the street with guns, so therefore the French Revolution was not patriarchal. I mean, definitely it wasn't in this sense egalitarian. Like they had this kind of Enlightenment idea which implies that you should treat people the same. I mean, in the American Revolution, it's even more like funny when you have this like that all men are created equal, and then you have slavery persisting. But this, so we have to remember this, and we shouldn't like use examples to make this go away. But at the same time, this doesn't change the nature of these revolutions in the sense that they were liberatory. And so this is one thing I want to say about. The second thing, I think everything that happened in Haiti was interesting because it's almost like idealist. Because in this sense, the relations of production were so different from the ones in France. So the whole kind of problem that the people had there was so different from the kind of political situation in France, and still it inspired a revolution. So in this sense, it's one of the rare cases where I would like not be able to provide you with a materialist answer. I just think it's really interesting that that it was taken seriously as an idea of liberty and equality, and not just like you have similar social relations and therefore it happened. One last thing, we also have to remember that there was not a uniform mass of black people in Haiti, but that this revolution was a revolution in the beginning at least of a specific educated, like part of the population. So it wasn't just like you had these like kind of uniform mass of like black slaves, and then you had the few rich white people. Like there was a complex society there. And if you want to study this revolution, I think it's really important to look at the different groups in the population. Yeah.
That the French Revolution is inspiring. I should say I think that it's also the case of the American Revolution, in spite of the unambiguous presence of slavery. I'm not going to say I don't agree with fundamental different mode of production, because my understanding, for what it's worth, is that shipping capitalism generates round itself transformations in production at the ends of the shipping circuit. And in particular, in relation to the sugar colonies, shipping capitalism generates plantation slavery, and plantation slavery is very near to being industrial production. In the same way as Arkwright's mills, cotton mills, were initially staffed by orphans who he bought outright from the City of London. Again, Jairus Banerjee is a spectrum of free and unfree labor. And in that sense, it's not only the case that the French Revolution inspires the Haitian Revolution, and then, of course, turns on it, that the French regime then turns on it, but also that it inspires the revolutionary movements across Latin America, as the United States, the American Revolution also does. So I think it's, I don't think, I agree, does it get away with, get rid of the fact that the French Revolution is patriarchalist? And not just it's patriarchalist in the sense of that there are a few French, there may be a few feminists, but the Code Napoleon reintroduces Roman patria potestas. Reintroduces Roman patria potestas and reduces the property rights and the contractual rights of women relative to the Ancien regime.
Well, that raises a question. How do you both see the role of Napoleon vis-a-vis the French Revolution? Do you see him as the continuation, or as in some way the end?
I don't want to make grand historical speculations about Napoleon. So the thing is, I do believe in this kind of really old school Marxist idea, and even Hegelian idea, that we have certain stages in history, and a lot of things that happen, they are like systems theory would talk about attractors. So they just don't just happen randomly. Like some things have to happen in a specific order. There's not just this kind of everyone could do everything at the same time. So socialism, for example, would not have been possible before industrial development and blah. So I do believe in these concepts, but you can't explain every single human being, or like really like a kind of how a battle went or something, by appealing to grand historical tendencies. So I think with Napoleon, he's really just a guy who was really good at war, and he was really lucky. So there was no grand historical necessity for him, right? Like, I mean, like if he was an idiot, or if they just didn't find the right guy, the French would have just lost and they would have been destroyed, or like the restoration would have come earlier, and then probably Europe would be it would have taken a little bit longer probably for like fully mature bourgeois relations to emerge. So there is kind of randomness in history, and there was I think I'm happy that he was such a good general. I think it was overall good, but there's no greater meaning behind it. Like there's nothing like that you could say that he was necessary, or he was like the Weltgeist or something. He was really just a guy who was good playing with like little guns and armies. Yeah.
There's a historical necessity. I think there's a historical necessity for the Prince of Orange. That if the De Witts had not been torn to pieces, and France would have reconquered the Netherlands, and we would be in counterfactual world in which there was no 1688, no 1776. Various science fiction writers have written counterfactual history of that sort. Yeah. And equally, that there needed to be Cromwell, that similarly the policy of the Council of State towards the Dutch Republic would have resulted in the victory of Spain.
Did there need to be Stalin?
I don't agree that there needed to be Stalin. I think Stalin is, if anything, the reverse. Stalin, if Trotsky had taken power in a military coup and launched a revolutionary war, then it's conceivable that you would have come that you would think of him as analogous to Cromwell or Napoleon. You know? I still don't think it would have led to socialism, because it's not the actual situation. But nonetheless, in terms of where Europe was after 1918, was that civil war on a European scale was inevitable, and it eventually eventuated in 1939 to 1945. If it had happened earlier, it might have had more successful results.
Okay, let's get questions from the floor.
Hello. Yep. Okay. I think this picks up on the Napoleon question well. So, so both of you have presented quite neat dichotomous sort of periodizations of history. Mike, you made a clear distinction between feudalism and capitalism, and located it roughly in the French Revolution, at least in France. And Dennis, you have this timeline of commercial society, bourgeois society until the mid-19th century, and then capitalism. And both of you use that to sort of separate the task of socialism, of proletarian socialism, from the political tasks of the French Revolution. And I wanted to have you reflect on that dichotomy and maybe call it into question. And I think there's two ways of doing that. One of them is the 18th Brumaire has been mentioned, with the famous beginning of, first time is tragedy, second time is farce. And the tragedy is Napoleon I, right? And farce Napoleon III. So do you, first of all, do you agree with that statement? Do you agree that Napoleon I, or maybe the whole of the French Revolution, was a tragedy? And if yes, do you think that all bourgeois revolutions have been tragedies? And I think a second way of getting at this with the Bonapartism question. So there's two very classical liberal critiques of the French Revolution, right? One of them might be attributed to someone like Hegel, that the whole tragedy of the revolution consists in the fact that early on in 1789, the executive had been weakened too much, and there was a kind of a legislative overreach that led to basically a dictatorship of the National Assembly. And Napoleon is the counter-reaction to that. And that's the necessity of Napoleon, or the Thermidorian reaction, depending on how you want to put it. And the other classical liberal critique of the French Revolution, Tocqueville, is that it never abolished the Ancien regime, in the sense that the revolution never abolished the administrative apparatus. So what is Bonapartism in the French Revolution, and how is it different from Bonapartism per se, or Bonapartism as in the Marxist concept?
I do have a lot of sympathy actually with some of the things that Hannah Arendt wrote in On Revolution. So I do think that there's a specific sense, especially if you're an anti-Bonapartist Marxist and you really like the 18th Brumaire and you have this kind of anti-administrative state point of view, which Marx expresses like a lot in his writings actually. So today we often associate like leftists are the ones who actually like the state, like they want a kind of, I don't know, like social democrats want a stronger state so that we can use the state against the capitalists and then all of our politics become state bound. Like I think I'm much more classically Marxist, I'm much more like 19th century radical, or like even, I guess most people would understand it the easiest if I said I'm much more anarchist than that. So I do believe in this idea of self-organization. And as I said before, I think the primary task of the revolution is to destroy the administrative state. So that's the most important thing. Like we can even have private capitalists continuing for a few years, as long as we have, we have the revolutionary power and we have destroyed this state apparatus so that it can't do anything. So in this sense, I do think the American Revolution did a better job than the French Revolution, but the French Revolution faced obstacles, and it was like in the center. Like the American Revolution was still like a peripheral, like a kind of backwater revolution, right? And so in the end, crushing it wasn't that important. With the French Revolution, it's completely different. Like you had a much more entrenched kind of upper class. You have had a much stronger state apparatus, and there was a much higher kind of, will of all of the reactionary powers to destroy it. So, like I would have liked it to have gone better, so that let's say the Jacobins do a revolutionary dictatorship, no one attacks, then they slowly transition to more democracy, they destroy the state apparatus, and then we have some kind of like more self-organized, maybe more American, but also more class-conscious kind of French Republican paradise. Or maybe the Germans and the Hungarians could have done it in 48 and stuff like this, or the French could have prevented Napoleon III. Maybe that would have been possible. Maybe that would have been bad for capitalism, because maybe it's good that they just won halfway, because then we could have like more brutal capitalists. Like, this is like a really unsavory but Marxist argument, and they exploit the working class more so the productive forces can develop more quickly. Like probably in a really kind of Republican government, they wouldn't have allowed this, to treat the workers like this, to extract this much of their time and life to build these machines that now mean that we have more stuff. But maybe that would have been like necessary, because it takes too long to develop it under like free circumstances, and then our problem would be that I don't know what happens, but we are not fast enough in accelerating the development of the productive forces. So I don't want to answer these questions here. Like I'm thinking about this every day, but I'm not like I vacillate every day. So if you ask me like in a week, I will say something different. So I don't want to bother you with my concrete answer to this. I'm just saying like these are the questions we have to ask. On the one hand, like our relation to the administrative state and what it means that the Americans did it more thoroughly. and on the other hand, the idea of developing the productive forces and whether a fully successful bourgeois revolution would have prevented this possibility of like rapid industrial revolution. And the third thing is just like a kind of mental effect. So, like for example, what would have happened if 48 would have succeeded? I think there would have been no Nazis, probably. But on the other hand, maybe if the French already had done it, yeah, then there wouldn't have been like good capitalism or like fast capitalism. So it's really complex. I can't give you a concrete answer to this, but these are like the kind of considerations that I think about when I ponder these questions. Yeah.
I think the counterfactual is largely delusive. My understanding, for what it's worth, capital, as I've said before, is the circuit, money, commodity, production organized by proletarians, larger commodity, money. The capitalist class rules in the money form, and it rules in liberalism in the money form through the free market in legal services as the sale and denial of justice in violation of Magna Carta, Chapter 29, through the routine bribery of politicians, through the advertising-funded media as a means of drowning out alternative political ideas. Take such a liberal institution, and the consequence is that it's not just that money rules in one country, it's that world money rules over every country. And as Rama Vasudevan has made the point, there are huge losses made on speculative investments in the London stock markets in 1847, which are transmitted to Paris and Vienna and the German states because of the fact that the pound has the same exorbitant privilege in the 19th century that the dollar has today, the bill on London. Yeah. And in the same way, in 1857, triggers crisis in the 1860s, in the 1870s, and so on and so on. Yeah. Then the consequence of that, what are you going to do about national independence? It becomes impossible to be a nationalist and to cling to the liberal form, because the liberal form delivers national subordination. So we get Bonapartism in the Louis Bonaparte sense. The Napoleon Bonaparte, I do understand to be this is the completion of the bourgeois revolution. Yeah. And you can see it with the code. The Louis Bonaparte, the problem essentially is that the French need to get out from under British neo-colonial control of the July monarchy, both of the Bourbon monarchy and of the July monarchy. The only way in which they can do that is to set up the all-powerful centralized state through a military dictator, quasi-military, a Bonaparte, Louis Bonaparte. Yeah? The result, therefore, is that Louis Bonaparte enables radical development of French capitalism in the 1850s through 1870. But he enables radical development of French capitalism because he sets it free from immediate British political control. Same way, United States Civil War sets free the United States from immediate British political control. The Bismarck sets free Germany from immediate British political control. So in that sense, as I say, I don't think that the classical liberal criticisms of the French Revolution have much purchase. I would add, however, the administrative state in 18th century Britain is radically stronger than the administrative state in 18th century France. Yeah? The excisemen reached down into, the customs officers reached down into the absolute bottom. But it's also the case, okay, the federal government is radically
And with
weak.
a much smaller population, a much better tax base.
Yeah.
In Britain.
In Britain. And it's also the case that, okay, the federal government in the United States until post-Second World War is not enormously strong. But my God, look at the regulations which were imposed in Massachusetts. The level of control of religious uniformity. Look at, before the Second World War, jaywalking legislation. The United States is a much more unfree country than the United Kingdom as far as the level of detailed regulation of personal behavior, the extent of the gulag of prison and prison labor, and so on and so forth. Just in terms of ordinary bourgeois negative liberty. So I think that there's a real danger of illusions in this respect. That's it.
Some more questions from the floor?
I would actually like to ask a question of my own because it's sort of... Yes, but it also connects to the previous question, so there's a justification to it. Because the previous question was on the differences that have emerged in the discussion, and I would maybe summarize it, or summarize the difference in the analysis of the French Revolution that sort of you, Dennis, emphasized more so the role of the petit bourgeois in the civil society, whereas you, Mike, sort of pointed or tried to outline what you believe is just the classical Marxist analysis that it's ultimately a revolution of capital. And so I think it's clear that there's a certain difference there, but I wanted to sort of ask what political difference do you think that makes ultimately for left today? Like, it was clear that you seem to think that there's something wrong about the analysis of the other person, but like, what political mistakes do you think follow from that wrong analysis, especially, I guess, for left today? And just quick second question, because it's from the prompt and it hasn't been answered yet. Why did the concept of the left emerge during the French Revolution and not, for example, during the American Revolution before or during 1848 after? Thank you.
Let me begin with the last thing, really shortly. I think it's just because it had more of it was more self-aware, because it was clearly conceived of as an internal conflict. Whereas in the American Revolution, yes, you had the loyalists, but the overwhelming threat from British intervention just made it like it had a stronger national character, therefore. And national, not in the sense of culturally national, but really in this sense of Willensnation. So people were just more unified in this sense in these camps of loyalists or revolutionaries. Whereas in the French Revolution, you had in the parliaments, in all of the different assemblies, the kinds of differences of opinion were just much more pronounced, because it was always like an internal affair primarily, and in the American Revolution it rather quickly became an affair of defense primarily. You obviously had both aspects in both revolutions, but I mean the kind of attention that people had on these issues was much more internally concentrated in the French Revolution. Oh, yeah, but I mean, this is a very good point, but I think in the English Revolution, therefore, you just didn't have the name, but you had a left, actually. And then, yeah, okay, maybe they also used these concepts, of course, but I mean, it was different in America. Like, you had you really had shifting allegiances, and then you had the Federalist question and stuff like this. But I do think that's a really good point, in also with regard to the kind of development in England. I do think that we don't talk about England enough. Like, the English Revolution, in the sense of like, we have to talk about Puritanism, we have to talk about we talked about the levelers and the diggers and stuff like this, but and then the emergence of actually what became the modern Tory party, the compromise between the different.
So just to clarify, in the left of the British Revolution, you're calling the levelers,
yes,
but not Cromwell.
Cromwell is really hard to pinpoint here, I think, but I would say that the levelers definitely form the left, and then the diggers, or the true levelers, are like the far left, something like this. Okay, but the question, what does it mean for us politically now? So the analysis I've provided, so why is it important for us now? I think it's important because we have to, again, reconsider our kind of relationship towards the state. I had this phase in my life, like I became at first like like an anarchist, and then I was, oh yes, we have to abolish the state, and then I became realistic. So I had this turn in my thinking where I thought, yeah, no, now there's Bernie Sanders and stuff. Okay, like I'm obviously a communist, but let's use this. Let's do some social democracy, and then it's going to be fine. And actually, the state is not that bad. We just have to get a little bit more democracy, but we can use it to create socialism because we can just make laws for doing it. And then we, we just take away some of the means of production. As long as we control the state, everything's fine. And then I read 18th Brumaire again and again and again, and then I understood, no, that's not possible, actually. So we have to account for the state as a real force, not just a tool used by a certain class that we can appropriate for ourselves and then use it to do whatever we want. The state apparatus has its own kind of dynamic. The state apparatus has certain interests also in keeping alive this administrative procedure. It's necessary for capitalism to survive. So there's not state versus capital like the liberals or the social democrats try, or like the libertarians try to tell us. It's inherently connected. Like capitalism in this, at least late capitalism, can't survive without an increasingly authoritarian state. So I think it's these questions with regard to the state that make it important to view already the French Revolution as a revolution of civil society versus the state. It means that the left has to build power within civil society, and it has to struggle against the existing Bonapartist state. So I think these questions are for me what's important about this analysis, so that we can make an analogy to today and see that today we again have to build civil society power, which now is, because we are in the age of capital, working class power, like trade unions, stuff like this, that we have to build up our power within civil society and then from there launch an attack against the state. So I do think it's important for today. Yeah.
I agree that the principal target of working class politics needs to be the state. Yeah. How I approach that is somewhat different. Part of this is actually just in terms of we have misunderstandings of the nature of the British polity before the 1870s. Yeah? And certainly that we think of, when people are, we misunderstand, we have the image of the American Revolution as an image of liberty, but it was also the case that British parliamentarism was an image of liberty for 19th century people. And we misunderstand it because we fail to see how the system, that polity worked.
Do we also misunderstand the French Revolution in a similar way?
Probably misunderstand the French Revolution along the way, I agree. Yeah. One of the things which is fundamental, when Engels says the Third Republic is the empire of 1799 without the emperor, one of the most fundamental things he's talking about is the degree of control which central government has of local government. And this is why, in a sense, Trump is reaction on the grandest possible scale. But we already had this reaction on the grandest possible scale in Britain, because from 1688 until the 20th century, it was a strong constitutional convention that central government had very limited powers over local government. And what went along with that was that the police was under the control of local government, that there were county militias, and so on and so on. And so our image, and I think the image of the idea that you need the centralized state for self-defense is problematical, partly because actually the very radically decentralized state of, on one hand, the British state has deeper tax revenues, has a more extensive administrative apparatus in the form of the excisemen and the customs officials and so on and so forth than the French state. On the other hand, it's massively less authoritarian than the French state. In fact, it's able to mobilize more effectively because it's less authoritarian than the French state, and it wins against Napoleon because because it's able to mobilize more effectively because it's less authoritarian than the French state. It can be those things because it is the dictatorship of money.
So you see the British state against Napoleon as playing a progressive role, or vice versa? Because traditionally leftists see
I think that it's
Napoleon is playing a progressive role.
Napoleon is playing a progressive role in the sense that he decisively destroys the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. There is a dual power in Europe between, on the one hand, emergent capitalism, and on the other hand, the feudal aristocracies, statized feudal aristocracies, and statized Catholic Church. And the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars between them decisively destroy that feudal, dual power in favor of dominance of capitalism with token restoration forms.
One thing, I would obviously disagree with this idea of feudalism and capitalism and talk about like the commercial society and the kind of transformation of the governments, but I do agree with you that, I mean, if you just look at France and the UK, then you could argue that probably under Napoleon with this really centralized state apparatus, the British system is more progressive from a Republican and from a Marxist perspective. But the geopolitical goals of these two states were such that I would side with Napoleon, because it wasn't just a war between Britain and Napoleon, it was a war by the reactionary powers of Europe against France and against the French Revolution, and then it was joined by the British. So that's like the complexity of the situation. So you don't have to say that France is better than Britain to side with France, because France is fighting Austria and Prussia and Russia and all of these reactionary powers.
Britain was the paymaster.
Yeah.
But why don't we get some more questions from the floor?
Have we answered your question, though?
Mike, you still have to answer the second question about why the concept of the left emerged during the French Revolution and not during another revolution, for example.
Why? Oh, why the French? I don't think that the idea. I think that the idea of the left is a convenient shorthand, but a deeply misleading shorthand. Yeah, I don't want to call the Levelers the left
Shorthand
wing
for
of
what?
the English Revolution, because the reality is this is just a shorthand about French politics, driven by the shape of the assembly, the chamber of the National Assembly. And okay, it's convenient for us to think about this, but it's actually deeply misleading.
But hasn't that idea become a universal concept now?
It's become a universal complex, but it's still a misleading concept, as we can see with the Union de la Gauche, the Parti de Gauche, the Die Linke, etc., etc., etc.
The left today, I absolutely think that's a misleading concept. But I do like the concept of the left historically, and I would just define it as such. Like the left is 19th century radicalism and its precursors and its children. So therefore, Marxism is part of the left because it's a child of 19th century radicalism. And the Jacobins are the left because they are a precursor of 19th century radicalism. So I would just use this moment because I think it's a nice moment to understand modern history, and then say, okay, you have the kind of moderates or like moderate liberals, you have the radicals, you have the reactionaries, and the radicals are the left. So everything that basically fed into the radicals or came out of them is the left. And that's an okay concept. It's neither. It's really weird. Like, it's not on the right, definitely, but it's also not on... It's just something that breaks the system, yeah.
The paradox of that, though, is that Mussolini was a leader of the syndicalist left wing of the Italian Socialist Party, who becomes a nationalist. Parvus, who wrote for the Leipziger Volkszeitung, was a strong leftist and advocate of anti-imperialism. By way of his anti-imperialism, becomes a Turkish nationalist, and in 1914 an advocate of German victory in the First World War. And so there's a sense in which the enormous strength of the Second International throws up the phenomenon that the far right has to disguise itself in socialist clothes, and that's true of Hitlerism as much as it is of, but also actually of Pilsudski's PSP revolutionary fraction, Polish Socialist Party revolutionary fraction. And then the consequence of that, unfortunately, is that the modern socialist movement has a constant illusion of thinking about the return of fascism, which is a particular outcome of the great strength of the German social democracy and its influence.
I think Parvis shows one can be an opportunist and a genius at once. But let's get more questions from the floor.
I'd like to repose the question of the capitalist or just bourgeois character of the French Revolution, because I think I've observed some disagreement there, which I find really interesting. So we've already sort of addressed this with Mike referring to the shipping industry as an early form of capitalist production, essentially arguing that that sort of shows that there's already a capitalist character to the French Revolution, while Dennis, you've really emphasized that there's some qualitative change in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. And obviously I have my own thoughts on this, but I really want to just set you up to reiterate, because to my mind, I feel, you can correct me on this, but I feel that you probably both would agree that, to Mike's point, nowadays we can look back into history and project at least some categories back into history, like, for example, we do with class struggles driving history. And we can say, well, there are obviously, for example, in the shipping industry, like roots of capitalist production. But also, I probably think, to Dennis' point, Mike would agree that in the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, we do have some very strong developments that have some qualitative change and enable at least recognition of things that have been there before and enable the workers' movement. So my question to you both is, what are the stakes of this? Why do you think that we should conceive of the character of the French Revolution the way you've said it? So for Dennis, why should we conceive of the French Revolution as not a revolution of capitalists just, but maybe something that was plausible in its time, and then came into a distinct crisis afterwards with the Industrial Revolution? And then for Mike, why shouldn't we conceive of the French Revolution as something that was really plausible in its time and only afterwards sort of came into crisis as a project? So why should we start sort of this struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie even before the French Revolution and distinguish it from it?
The first reason is like really nitpicky and autistic, but I do think we have to like be clear about what Marx says in Capital, and it's really important for this whole thing to work that we have workers who are separated from the means of production. And that's a question of the development of productive forces. Like, if I can have like my small hammer, right, and I can like just build something with my hammer in my room, then I'm not separated from the means of production, because you can't do something better. Like if I'm recent, like let's say I'm like skilled enough to do the job, and I can just have my hammer and do my thing, boom, 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 and then I can work. Like I can work and build something that I can sell to you, and then I get my beer and I get my house and everything's fine. But if I have this to compete with this big ass factory that's million times or like 1,000 times more effective than I am, then I'm not able to survive. Like I have to sell my labor power to the factory owner, because if I do it at home with my little hammer, I will never be able to sell it at a price that sustains my life. So that's a really important thing, and just we have to think about this when we think about capitalism. Not just capitalism equals exchange. So like if we have people who just have things and they have money or not, or exchange things, and then it's capitalism. No, it's really important for capitalism that we have this kind of consolidated, as you said it actually, consolidated means of production, like this big factory is something that someone can own and that you can't just get by getting a hammer. So I think that's important just for our understanding of Marxist economics. And the second thing is, I also studied some history, and it's just not true in the sense of like sociologically, and it's even like it's even bad for morale for Marxists to always tell the story that there was actually already like a struggle between workers and capitalists in the French Revolution. And then if you actually look at the revolutionaries and the masses on the street, and it's just not there. Like it's not how this thing worked. And then I do think from a kind of idea of I want to do justice to these ideas that they had. I do even think that there is some, now I have to get a little bit philosophical, but that there's also some kind of regression of consciousness from even from the ancients over like the Puritans, and then classical republicanism, and then you have you know, like radicalism in the 19th century, and then socialism. On the one hand, there's a progression in consciousness, but in another way, there's a regression of consciousness of freedom. Like things get, in a sense, profaned in a way that doesn't always work. And I do think we have to keep
Ancient conception of freedom in some way better.
because it had a kind of idea of the inherent worth of being together and creatively changing your environment as you know, as free citizens, or what Arendt calls this kind of equality and difference at the same time. Like something that actually always pops up in revolutionary movements, that psychologically is extremely important, why people form things like trade unions or these sections in Paris, or why we are here. Like, and to say that this doesn't matter, and it's actually all about, firstly, like kind of constitutions, and then after a while it's just about time and stuff, is in a certain way a regression. But I do think in overall it's good that we've moved on from these ideas, but there are some aspects to it, like in a dialectical manner, that we have to keep alive. And so we have to take them seriously and not project back onto them like things that are technically impossible, historically wrong, and that do just injustice to their ideas, which I think were sound at that time. And it's always good to move back and take a look at them and view ourselves from the perspective of a 19th century radical, which Marx was. Like Marx was a 19th century radical, and he was faced with industrial society, and then he developed his theories. And now we have Lenin and Stalin. I don't say there's, I love Lenin, but we have Lenin and Stalin in modern social democracy, and this changes our view of Marxism, because we now view them from the perspective of social democracy, Leninism and Stalinism. And I'm saying, like, let's go back to radicalism or to the French Revolution, take another look at Marxism, and it looks different from this perspective. And I think in many ways it looks better, or it's clearer than.
Taking a Republican perspective in relation to the question of the state. I think that the principal conclusion which comes from taking a Republican perspective to the question of the state is that we need to return to the idea of term limits. That although I'm currently involved in fighting against the use of sortition in the Corbynista, your party, that's because they aren't proposing to apply sortition to themselves. The top leaders, they're going to be outside the sortition. There's going to be sortition of the membership rather than delegates or local branches or anything like that. But nonetheless, trial by jury is a fundamental matter to be maintained and defended, etc., etc. Capitalists and petty bourgeois, my understanding is that capitalists are mostly very unusually successful petty bourgeois. And that therefore, actually, when a big movement of the petty bourgeois arises, the natural leadership of it will be capitalists. How will that natural leadership be expressed? Actually, you don't usually get to talk to a head honcho capitalist. You get to talk to his brief or his other agent, his lawyer. Yeah. So that the fact that the political leadership of the bourgeois revolutions is in the hands of lawyers just reflects the nature of the capitalist class. The capitalist class it gets its right to exploit by virtue of being the wealth creators.
What about Dennis's argument that there wasn't a capitalist class in France?
Okay, so I reject this argument. Yeah? Straightforwardly. Yeah? I do think that the shipping industry is a capitalist enterprise, and that capitalist enterprise reshapes the relations of production at both ends of the shipping circuit. Yeah, and
someone like Robespierre as an agent of the capitalist class?
I see someone like Robespierre and these people as agents of a bourgeoisie which includes a capitalist class, but that the interest of
one thing. But do you think the shipping companies controlled important actors in the French Revolution?
The decisive question is going to be, how is the state going to fund itself? And the decisive shift is from a state which subsists by virtue of the claim to consuetudines and in France, the sale of offices and such, to a state which is able to fund itself by financial techniques which were pioneered in the Italian city-states, perfected in the Netherlands and in Britain. Yeah? That consequence of that will be, once you've made a state like that, the consequence of that will be, even if you've got a very weak capital to start with, rapid, explosive development of capital. And that's documented for the 1790s through the 1800s. There is explosive development of what anybody who isn't obsessed with steam would call capitalism. My former colleague Joshua Getzler, who wrote on English water law, pointed out that most of British productive industry was powered by water wheels right down till the 1880s, 1890s. It was nonetheless industry. As far as Britain was concerned, as of 1700, half the population was wage dependent. Half.
It's a complete outlier here. Like if you compare
Britain
the social history,
Britain is an outlier. But it is the context of the French Revolution is that France has been defeated by Britain in 1689 to 1696, in 1703 to 1714, in the 1740s, in 1756 to 1763, and that France has once succeeded in defeating Britain in the American Revolution and has only succeeded in creating a new bourgeois regime. So that then the question is posed, how do we imitate? You know, it's not that, how do we imitate Britain for the state, it's posed?
Okay, I think we should get back to questions from the floor, but it would seem to me that the fiscal crisis of the French state that triggers off the revolution is one of the inability to raise taxes, and it's predominantly a system of taxation based upon the subordinated agrarian classes. Let's go back to questions from
Yeah, I agree with that. It's tallage was what we called it in England.
So this is, it's a bit of a weird framing. I was trying to think about the absence of Dominique Paggiani, right? And one of the reasons why we asked him to come on the panel, and it's why it's unfortunate that he's not here, is that he experienced a certain education about the French Revolution through the New Left, right? And I think when we're asking the question of like, how does the French Revolution task us today? What we're pointing to is the continued repetition of importance of the French Revolution that just kind of comes up in the left. And it's like, okay, what is that about? So the way I'm going to frame this question is, what was the first time that you learned about the French Revolution as someone who was participating in the left or as a socialist? And what were some important changes that you felt in your understanding of the French Revolution? Because, you know, you could learn about the French Revolution and just be like, okay, I now know about it, I can like leave it in the past. But, you know, for a lot of leftists, it's like kind of a significant historical event. So I'm just curious how you first would have learned about this historical event.
It's a circular thing, probably. Like I learned about it like in a systematic way the first time in school, but there it was really bad, I think. Like it was just like the standard story of like there was these evil radical people and then there was the good moderates, and obviously the good moderates should have won. And because I had this kind of, I wasn't even left wing back then, I just had like a kind of aesthetic preference for the Jacobins. I just thought they're so much cooler because it's uncool to be moderate, so either you have to be full-on aristocrat sympathizer or you go with the cool people, right? With the choppy things, and they had their like, kind of red hats, right? And I thought like that looks a little bit silly, but also cool because they look so different. So yeah, I just had this aesthetic preference for them. And then I joined like the anarcho-syndicalists, and then I went to university and became a Marxist. And then it started in another way. So you had always this kind of double thing. On the one hand, there was this reverence, like you were supposed to like worship them, and on the other hand, always this kind of, they were so limited, and you know, like the wrong people won. And even Robespierre, he was still like just like a really radical bourgeois, basically half capitalist, half proletarian. So there was this kind of view. So it's on the one hand like a kind of cultural kind of point of reference, something you have to know, and you know what side you're on. Obviously you say I'm for the most radical people, the Abattists probably, and then even Robespierre wasn't radical enough, okay, like, so something like this. And then when I studied it in university, I had this, my interest was mainly also in religious stuff, like the cult of the supreme being and the cult of reason. I thought this is really nice. I had this idea that I really loved this kind of hyper-modernism with the metric system and stuff like this, how they put statues of reason and freedom in the churches. So then now I'm like a convinced adherent of the cult of reason. Like I'm actually practicing this, but I think it's good because it's, on the one hand, it's not theistic, but it still acknowledges this kind of, you know, people want to come together and stuff. So I really liked this. It was for me proto-Bauhaus, basically, that they had these ideas of like big ass buildings and this metric system, and it was, and the revolutionary calendar. I always wanted to like learn it and always have it on my phone, but I didn't find out how. So I liked all of these things. And then when I did my PhD, I did a lot of stuff on classical republicanism, actually because I wanted to understand Hayek, but then I fell into the Rousseau hole again. Then I read 18th Brumaire, and then I engaged also with the things Catron said. Like I really didn't like him before because we had other troubles with materialism, but then on this issue of the administrative state and stuff, I really thought like, oh, this is exactly what I've read in Rousseau and what I've like thought about in my classical republicanism time. It was also the Biden age, so back then I was really pissed at the Democrats. Like now I'm again pissed at Trump, right? But back then I was really like in this, oh no, shit, the administrative state and the left have now allied, so like even though I hate the right-wingers, I hate this even more in some way because it's like authoritarian Bonapartism. No, the other way around. I think now I'm really happy that it's now the right-wingers who do the authoritarianism again. So I don't have to defend them anymore, and I can like again be a good Republican and hate them. Because before, every time I hated on them, I felt like empowering the administrative state in some way to repress these people, which would actually build structures that are antithetical to liberty and will target us later. And now it's good that he's doing the authoritarian, anti-republican things, so now I can, again, you know, hate them. So yeah, no, now for me it's like, I think now I'm in my phase where I like the French Revolution the most in my life, because now I have this kind of more, I don't think it's a regressive thing that they didn't go far enough. I think they had exactly the right ideas, or basically the right ideas, the bourgeois revolutions for that time, and that we have to actually, there's a lot we can learn from them. So I do think what I said before, that let's go a little bit back and reacquire this classical Republican or 19th century radical or Jacobin perspective and look at Marxism from this perspective. I do think it's really productive to do it this way. Yeah.
Rather different story. My family was liberals, capital L liberals, at a time when the Liberal Party's MPs could fit in a telephone box, because that was continuity of family tradition back to Whiggism. They claimed, I don't know whether truthfully, descent from a regicide. So I was brought up in unapologetically Whig history. Yeah? And I was taught in school, in primary school I was taught the sort of classic Willy Willy, Harry Stee, Harry Dick John, Harry 3 chronology in entertaining form all the way down to the 19th century, including why did Cornwallis lose the Battle of Yorktown? Because he let de grass grow under his feet. And William of Orange came to the throne and all the people cried pip pip hooray. And then in secondary school, early modern England and Europe, and a special subject on the American Civil War, taught by a couple of guys who were pupils of Hill and that school. And I was also in secondary school sent to write about Marx for a sixth form presentation, and the only book I could find was Capital One. So I slogged my way through the whole of Capital One at the age of 16. Makes me rather different. Then I came across the French Revolution again through reading Trotsky in 1974, I had been in GLF, in Gay Liberation Front in 70-71. I thought of myself as an anarcho-syndicalist at the time of the first miners' strike in 72. Reading Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution made me a Trotskyist and led me into joining a Trotskyist organization, which I stayed in. So Trotsky's interpretation of the French Revolution, I critique that now. I critique it now primarily because I think that Trotsky's interpretation of the French Revolution is part of the reason why the Trotskyists failed to understand Stalinism and the failure of the Russian Revolution. That's it.
I want to get back to questions from the floor, but I want to briefly, even though I'm not a panelist, make a comment. So I became interested in the French Revolution because in 1989, on the bicentennial, I happened to be in Paris, and I started reading about it. And the reason I mentioned that is that 1989 was, of course, a very significant year for the left in a negative sense, unlike 1789 in a positive sense, and that since 1989, and really before then, there's been a massive historiographical regression in terms of the discussion of the French Revolution. So that the French Revolution has, so to speak, been obliterated by the collapse of Stalinism and the crisis of Marxism. But let's go back to questions.
Is this working? Yeah, I want to take up Dennis's interest of a kind of recovery of Marxism by going back to the bourgeois revolution and early socialism up to Marx rather than going back through the 20th century to Marx, because I agree that it's a highly desiccated kind of caricature that we're getting from some of this regression of historical consciousness that Richard was just alluding to, which has much deeper roots than just the late 20th century. And I want to bring out what I think is a tension between you and Mike, but maybe a tension within what you're saying as well, Dennis, which is the recognition that the high bourgeois revolutions are revolutions against revolutionary forms of state, of modern bourgeois states, of absolutist states, but even against bourgeois revolutions. The American Revolution's significance is surely that it's a revolution within the British Revolution. And this is where I would bring up something like Adam Smith's critique of mercantilism as a category of the crisis of the British Revolution. And a renewal of the question of the subordination of the state to society. That the question of the rise of the early modern state is paradoxically one of centralization and the expansion of power and the subordination of power to the state, to society. Yeah, maybe farther back, like this. Okay. And this is where I want to raise this issue of what Mike called the rule of money. And really what the stakes are in talking about Marx's approach to the Industrial Revolution. Because Adam Smith has already said that the power of money is not political power. It's the power over labor. And this is where I want to say that when Marx says the bourgeoisie can no longer rule, he doesn't mean control of the state. He means they no longer, that the project of the third estate's self-emancipation is contradictory. That the command over labor of the bourgeoisie, the natural power of the bourgeoisie, of the revolution in the name of labor, the third estate, is itself self-contradictory. And this is where I would get to the question of, I guess I would push Mike to say, I think more explicitly, that he rejects Marxism or Marx's thought on this matter. That for Marx, the issue is not ultimately the domain of freedom and property in Bentham. That it's not the way that money can corrupt the state, etc., which is ultimately a critique of mercantilism. It's a bourgeois critique of the crisis of the bourgeois revolution. But it's rather the self-contradiction in the sphere of production, which is not just a question, I think we should go beyond just a question of the removal of the means of production from the hands of the proletariat and talk about the transformation in social relations themselves, what Marx would call the self-realization of surplus value through what he calls relative surplus value, through machine production, as the heart of the Industrial Revolution, expressed as socialism, right? That the phenomenal expression of the Industrial Revolution is absolutely central to this question, right? It's not just a technical matter. It's how to explain the crisis of the bourgeois revolution as expressed by the emergence of socialism, right? And that's what Marx is trying to get at through the analysis of production. So my question is, how do we understand the project of the subordination of the state to society? Picking up on Dennis, your sort of affirmation of anarchism as the goal of socialism. Like, is the goal of socialism in that sense a recovery and transformation under changed circumstances of the goal of bourgeois revolution in the way that you understand it?
Okay, so let's begin like this. I do agree, actually, that the emergence of socialism is itself a crisis of capitalism. And it's the reason why the kind of after the 48 revolution, like maybe, this is my assessment, the 48 revolution could have worked, but after the 48 revolution, the project of radicalism was in its whole essence dead, and specifically because of the emergence of socialism and of the emergence of, which is connected to it, of a large workers' movement, right? Because you needed to, for the bourgeois revolution, and even the radicals were still part of the bourgeois revolutionary project, you needed this kind of alliance of the petit bourgeoisie with the emerging working class. So you needed a kind of mass of people that's united against the power of the most privileged classes and especially the state. And this alliance is no longer sustainable if socialism exists. So therefore, I really found this interesting when you said, what about fascism? Is it left or right? No, fascism is exactly in one sense, like I do also have other theories of fascism. I do also think it has something to do with anti-modernism and with the failure of the left and stuff, but it's also just a reaction on the left because this kind of social base of radicalism or of Jacobinism is now being split because socialism emerges as an independent political force. And if this happens, then basically the rest of what radicalism was doesn't have a political home. So they can join the emerging capitalists and become liberal conservatives or something like this. But a part of this group also joins fascism. So there is a kind of residue of radicalism also in fascism. Fascism is not just the old right that has rebranded itself. It's more like sociologically, it's a mix of both. It's the non-proletarian parts of the radical movement combining with parts of what has been the reactionary movement before. So you have new alliances and stuff like this. I do think that's a lot of this I would put in less philosophical terms than you, although I am a philosopher, but I think with these things, I would do it in a little bit more materialist way. But I do basically agree that there is a fundamental crisis of capitalism that is created by the emergence of socialism. But the emergence of socialism is also something related to the development of productive forces. So it has something to do with the machinery, with the fact that the workers are separated from their means of production. Socialism is not just an idea that's spontaneously emerging or that some smart people like Marx have developed. Socialism is a specific stage in the consciousness of the labor movement, or of the organized workforce, like the trade unions, at a specific stage of the kind of escalation of class struggle. And this requires a working class in the proletariat. This requires workers who are separated from the means of production. So there is the machinery plays an important part of it. Like you need to consolidate the means of production. You need to take them from the people and turn them into proletarians. And then you can have class struggle. And then socialism emerges. And then radical politics in the classical sense becomes impossible. So all of these phenomena are connected in this way. But yeah, I think maybe I've said enough for now.
In my view, there's no such thing as a non-mercantilist capitalist state. Free trade is a mercantilist policy in the interests of the world-dominant capitalist state, and is therefore the policy of the Netherlands in the 17th century, and ceases to be the policy of the Netherlands later, is the policy of Britain in the 19th century, and ceases to be the policy of Britain later, is the policy of the United States as far as the rest of the world is concerned, because the United States never completely ceases to pursue protectionist. There's no point at which the United States ceases to pursue protectionist policies. I think there are reasons why that is necessary, which is essentially about the nature of money. There is insufficient gold, silver, and copper in the world for a pure commodity money system. In order to have sufficient money for the transactions need of a moderately complex economy, you have to have credit money. The existence of credit money depends on regular, routinized state enforcement. the existence of regular routinized state enforcement depends on discrimination against foreign actors. Okay, so then back to it's not that money, that the state is ruled over by money. If we simply reduce money to the power of money to the power over labor in industry, actually, because money itself depends on the state, and that is just as much true of the bill on London in the 18th century or of the bill on Amsterdam in the 17th. Because money depends on the state, it is illusory to suppose that capital can exist simply as the power of money over labor in the absence of the power of money over and in the state. In relation to the sequence, the workers, first you have the industrialization, then you have the workers' movement, then you have socialism. I don't think that works. Basically, it was a point that was made in the previous session, I can't remember who made it, notorious weakness of socialism as a political trend in 19th century Britain and the 20th century United States. That radicalism remained the dominant form of working class political thought in both of these countries, in spite of the existence of in Britain, powerful trade union movements.
Would you attribute that weakness of socialism to the very prior success of the bourgeois revolution? Whereas in Germany and Russia, Marxism seemed to
what I would say is this. Precisely, yes, the prior success of the bourgeois revolution leads to the dominance of industrial production in the first place in Britain and later in the United States. That dominance of industrial production means that competitor states are forced to use increased labor repression in order to be able to compete with the dominant producer. In order to attract capital, it's clearest in Russia, where it's clear that in order to attract foreign capital, which they need in order to modernize, they have to produce such savage repression of the trade union movement that they cannot prevent it from going
But
radical.
what about the argument that something like the Social Democratic Party in Germany plays an essentially liberal role, that more liberal societies emerging from bourgeois revolutions like Britain, France, the United States, didn't need in that
We glossed over something that I think is really important, because what you said, like, I never thought about it, but it's actually really interesting. You had this idea of, okay, it depends on the industrial development, but that's not actually, like, in the case of, if we compare Germany to France, then we can clearly see, like, France had a much stronger radical movement in the working class even after the emergence of industrial relations. Like, it lingered for longer in France. And in Germany, the radical movement was basically defeated in 48, and then socialism could take hold more quickly. But the degree of industrialization is similar in both countries. So therefore, I've
in Germany.
Yeah, it was even greater in Germany, but it was definitely, like, you can't say that, okay, it's because, you know, England had a stronger radical movement and then France also had it because it had more industry. It seems to have something to do maybe with the success of the bourgeois revolution on a purely, like, political level or something like that. I'm not sure about this. I just wanted us to understand what we're talking about, the kind of idea that radicalism had a longer lifespan in the countries where bourgeois revolutions were more or less successful, yeah.
I think I would put it as much more contingent development. You know? There is an objective tendency towards the working class as it grows as a class, throwing up trade union organisation. That goes back a long way in Britain. Confederacy of Masons Act 1425 prohibits organisations of workers to raise wages. Building workers to raise wages. Okay, the building trade is not going to transform the society in the same way in which other industries do. But on the other hand, contingently, the 48ers include a cohort of communists coming out of the Communist League and influenced directly or indirectly influenced by the Communist League. In 1863, Bismarck decides to play footsie with LaSalle in order to undermine German liberalism by offering universal suffrage in the North German Confederation and building up a labor monarchist counterweight to liberalism. And that creates the ADAV, and the ADAV throws off the liberals throw up their counterweight, the VDAV, the Verein Deutsche Arbeitervereine. The VDAV throws up the Saxon People's Party of Liebknecht and Bebel, which is a liberal party, but then the labor monarchism of the ADAV throws off a series of splits which creates the Eisenach Party and then the Gotha Unification, and that takes off. But it takes off, I think, because of the contingent fact of Bebel and Liebknecht disagreeing with Marx and Engels and abstaining.
Just one thing so that we can make this clear.
Wait, sorry,
no,
we've been
it's
gone
really
for...
Like one sentence. I'm not talking about a necessary causation. I'm just saying like you need to have the workers' movement for a big socialist movement. I'm not saying the workers' movement will necessarily immediately create socialism. Just to be clear about this.
But the German trade unions are thrown off by... trade unionism in itself is effectively repressed by the Prussian state, but is that trade unions are then thrown off by first the Eisenachers and then the ADAV.
Okay, let's try to get some more questions.
Yeah, so we've been going for quite some time now. Unfortunately, I think not all questions will be able to be done. Let's have 2 quick questions and then we'll wrap up. I'll do one here and then one there.
Oh, keep it a bit far away. Is this good? This is the right way. Okay, thank you. This is for all 3 panelists. Richard had said that since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, the French Revolution, or the historiography of the French Revolution, our understanding of it, had been obliterated. I wanted to ask what we might have lost about the French Revolution, and also pose an earlier debate within socialism about the French Revolution, namely that between Jean Jaurès and Sorel in the Second International, about really the relationship of, and I think this was just coming up in Mike's remarks, the socialist revolution to the democratic republic. And I just wanted to read quickly a short quote from Kautsky about this, which one of our members put in the Platypus Review. Okay. Kautsky says, wait, where do I want to start? Okay. Only the proletariat becomes republican in principle due to its position among the classes of modern, and consequently, the proletariat can only come to power in the republic. On the other hand, the bourgeoisie is most directly able to exercise its rule in a parliamentary republic or a parliamentary monarchy whose head is merely decorative. The parliamentary form of government is the one which corresponds to its class interests. Thus, the same republic which forms the basis for the emancipation of the proletariat can at the same time become the basis for class domination. The proletariat, the only class that is republican in principle in shedding its blood for the republic, thereby created the perfect condition for its further exploitation. And continuing, Marx writes, but as Marx noted immediately after the revolution's conclusion, the only thing the men of 1848 had borrowed from the Jacobins of 1793 was their costumes, while the men of the revolution still believed that the tasks they had to carry out were the same as those of 1793, while they believed that the same forces were at their command and the same methods were called for, the battlefield weapons and even the fighters themselves had thoroughly changed. as encouraging as the revolutionary tradition was, it became an obstacle for the new revolution because it hampered the recognition of the real tasks at hand as well as the means of solving them. And Kautsky also calls this a sort of Republican superstition that is duping the workers. So I wanted to ask, why is it that socialists have a debate about the French Revolution? What's important about it? What might be lost about it? And also, how are you guys informed by today in thinking about the French Revolution? And I'm thinking particularly about not only the state of the left today, but the fact that for the last 10 years, the major force of change, revolutionary or otherwise, has been Donald Trump. Thank you.
So, I think I wanted to mention this actually in my initial statement, and then I had other things to say. But there is this kind of one idea of the one revolution being political and the other one being social, but what is meant by social is normally economic. So that we have this idea, okay, the bourgeois revolution is just like, that's the political revolution. And whatever happens afterwards, like what we call like a socialist revolution maybe, it's then not political anymore. I do think it's much more complicated. Like the political problem reappears or seems to reappear. And for me, as I have to mention it again, but the 18th Brumaire is of utmost importance. Because it might be the case that from the beginning in the earliest bourgeois revolutions it was kind of doomed because these relations of domination that they fought against would come back. We even talked about these ideas of is the legislative too strong, and we have been talking about a little bit the courts and stuff like this. So it might be the case that if you try to implement a kind of free political system, you will be faced with problems of efficiency or something like this under certain conditions, so that you need to revert back to authoritarianism. I do not really believe that this is true for the pre-industrial period, but certainly it's true with industrialization. So if you have industrial capitalism, you can't really be Republican. So it's just not possible because the system of capitalism is so volatile and the social relations are so antagonistic that a free system of government wouldn't be compatible with this kind of, volatile system. And therefore, there is a necessity of Bonapartism and of the administrative state. This doesn't mean that we should accept it. On the contrary, I think, therefore, fighting for specific Republican ideas which we might describe as bourgeois liberties are actually transcending the possibilities of capitalism. Because you can't have, in industrial capitalism, you can't have a free system. You need a strong centralized executive in order to intervene at will. So you can't do it by rule of law, for example. It would be too cumbersome, right? Like they need people to be able to invest and divest and do things on an ad hoc basis, like as an executive prerogative. So therefore, these kinds of Bonapartist or absolutist structures always re-emerge, like especially under industrial capitalism, they have to re-emerge. And therefore we have been seeing this kind of expansion of the administrative state and of executive powers in the United States, at least since the New Deal. And it's been like a continuous process. Like Trump is just like comically obvious about it, but everyone has been doing it. Like Obama has been doing it, Biden has been doing it, like it has been done the whole time. All of these kinds of bourgeois liberties have been undermined and they have strengthened the executive. They have basically abolished a lot of rights that Americans had after the bourgeois revolutions. So this is like a normal thing that happens. And the left shouldn't like accept this and say, yeah, we also agree with this because this might help us to pass some kinds of, social reforms or like increase taxation on the rich, or do this kind of reformist, not even reformist, like Bonapartist pseudo-socialist thing. We shouldn't do that. We should insist on the Republican stuff, and then understand that it's not possible to actually implement it without a proletarian mass movement. And these are also the conditions we need for achieving socialism. So I completely reject this idea of a kind of divorced, like on the one hand, a political struggle for democracy, on the other hand, the social revolution. I think it's a kind of combined process, and the power for political struggle will come from civil society organizing and the other way around. So that would be my answer.
Can I briefly answer the question? So I'm not actually a panelist, and if I've overplayed my hand as a strong moderator, I apologize. So my answer to the question, my comment was about historiography, and it wasn't necessarily about socialist, but general historical memory. So contrary to the assertion some made, or perhaps complementary to it, I think that the end of the Cold War did more damage to the memory of the French Revolution than the Cold War. And that's because both sides of the Cold War, the liberal side, or the Anglo-American liberal tradition in the historiography, and the Marxism tradition, which has been, I think, somewhat simplistically called Stalinism, but some of it was, both of those preserve some aspect of the memory of the French Revolution. And I would say the end of the Cold War caused both to disintegrate. That on the one hand, a disillusion with Stalinism led to a disillusion with Marxism and that historical meta-narrative, and a disillusion, the victory, apparent victory of a Western liberalism actually coincided with a disillusion with liberalism and a kind of postmodernism that was a disillusion of any kind of faith in progressive history.
I agree with that, though I think it begins a little earlier. It begins with the nouveau philosophe.
Yes, it does begin earlier.
It begins with Foucault. It begins with the appropriation of Adorno dialectic of enlightenment as a weapon against the left. In relation to Kautsky and the debate between Jaurès and Sorel, what's at issue in this is the Mitterrand debate. Is it right to join a bourgeois government as a socialist minister for the sake of the defense of La République against the monarchists? And to be honest, I think Kautsky on the bourgeois constitution, Ben Lewis has translated both parliamentarism and socialism, and his series Republican Social Democracy in France, which is an intervention, which you may be quoting from, I'm not sure. The problem essentially is that Kautsky totally accepts the necessity of the civil bureaucracy. That becomes clear in his action program. He accepts the professional police. He accepts the civil bureaucracy. He accepts the independence of the judiciary. Yeah. In that, all that stuff, he's departing from Marx's arguments about the Paris Commune. And I think comrades who upholding the American Republic as the model of the Republic, as modern modernity, the constant objection to the Jacobins, are not reading the Civil War in France, or not paying sufficient attention to the arguments of the Civil War in France. But I also agree, however, that we have to recognize, we've been talking again about the authority relations involved in capital, in industrial production. I've made this point many times before. There's a moment at the passage of from the first part of Capital One to the second part of Capital One, where Marx says, now we leave the realm of freedom and equality in the marketplace and join, I cannot remember the exact expression, the realm of authority in the factory. Instead of the worker coming along as equal with the capitalist to dicker for his wages, now he follows with his head held down. Yeah. And what follows that is then long discussion, which people are, I think, insufficiently willing to take seriously of the process by which the working class was expropriated from the land in England, the development of the working class in England. It's not enough to have your hammer if you haven't got a workplace to use it in. It's not enough, for that matter, the capitalists in the early 19th century operate on the basis they hired machines to the workers who worked the machines. So technically the workers who work machines are lessees, but they're lessees under the control of capital. Yeah. And the consequence is that capitalism inherently involves both liberalism and authoritarianism. And what we've seen, we saw an enormous swing in favor of liberalism and against authoritarianism in the upshot of 1945 and in the Cold War, particularly actually the later period of the Cold War. Human rights became an enormously influential doctrine. Judicial independence was promoted across the world. Written constitutions, etc. This is the Carter administration turning from social democracy to neoliberalism. The other side of that was Brzezinski arming the not the Taliban, the Mujahideen. Before the Soviets intervened in Afghanistan, Brzezinski was arming the Mujahideen against Daoud's regime in Afghanistan. Yeah. And going along with that, the United States merely destructive indirect interventions in Mozambique and Angola, in Lebanon, etc. And then we get, in response to that, the rise of Islamism. And after the rise of Islamism, the Putin administration in Russia kicking off in 2000, Hindutva, revisionism in Japan. Trump is not the guy who's making the moves here. Trump is the latest expression of a swing of capitalist public politics back towards authoritarianism, nationalism, patriarchy. And it's, in a sense, the empire coming home in the same way as immigration in Britain is, quote, the empire coming home. It's the reflex back on you. Because it's also the case that actually neoliberalism entailed the creation of wild instability in third world countries by way of odious debt. That neoliberalism, by reducing state welfare provision, entailed the rise of religious welfare provision as an alternative, religious charity, entailed increased dependence on the family. Sorry, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, it was very interesting, but it was not at all short. So I think we don't really have...
Short and then go drinking.
I'm sorry, I was told I have to wrap up.